Hi, this is Vladimir Penkrat coming to you live from Indegene. As a differentiated partner to the life science industry for the past 25 years, we've been taking conventional life science practices, challenging the status quo, exploring the digital agenda, and designing the future of work. As head of regulatory affairs, we have the expertise and responsibility to ensure that we're delivering to global regulatory requirements and helping our clients improve their probability of regulatory success. We're here today to discuss more about generative AI. There's been a lot of chatter in social media in regards to this, and now this is creeping into the lexicon of pharma and medical device companies that are beginning to explore what are the relevant applicability of this technology, what are the considerations associated with that, and how do we really begin to incubate in an environment that can be safe and ensure that we are managed in an approach to consider this technology's applicability to our existing platform of solutions. In that respect, we'd like to use today to really create a balanced perspective and understanding more about this technology, get some backdrop and understanding the definitions associated with it, what are various GPTs that might exist in the market, and likewise understand what are the applicability in regulatory affairs. I'm joined by a number of my esteemed colleagues in the industry as panelists that have come independently to really speak a bit more from their perspectives on the potential of this technology, how it might be considered, and likewise considerations associated with any new technology deployment like this. I'd like to first introduce David Berglund, who's Executive Director and Global Head of Regulatory Operations at AstraZeneca. David, if you don't mind giving a couple of words, that'd be great. You're on mute, David. Sorry.
I'm indeed. I'm David Berglund. I'm leading the global regulatory operations teams within AstraZeneca. And I want to thank you for inviting me to share some personal thoughts here on this very exciting and new technology. And I'm saying new in a sense, not that the idea is new. The idea has been there for a long time, but we've seen some step changes in how technology has evolved and the fact that it's starting to be adopted even by the mainstream.
Great. Thanks, David. I likewise would like to thank Sudhir Somaneni, Head of Regulatory Solutions from Pfizer. Sudhir, maybe you can give a couple of words yourself. That'd be great.
Absolutely. Thank you, Vlad. My name is Sudhir Somaneni. I work at Pfizer. I have responsibilities to strategize, build, and operate various capabilities for our regulatory affairs organization. A bit about a background. I come from clinical. Regulatory is new, but about 6 years ago, I ran a data sciences team that did a lot of work in the area of predictive analytics. Good amount of success when it comes to structured data as the substrate for those experiments. But when it came to unstructured data, which generative AI is now solving for, it was a series of setbacks back then. It's really exciting to see how some of the capabilities are coming to fruition in the form of generative AI and many other incarnations of this technology. So again, with that, I'll pass it over to Vlad.
Great, thanks, Sudhir. Last, I'd like to introduce Ritesh Dogra, who's Associate Vice President at Indegene for Medical Technologies. Ritesh, a couple of words from you as well.
Thanks, Vlad, and pleasure to be in the august company of all of you, including our colleagues. I'm Ritesh, and I lead medical technologies at Indegene. And when we say medical technologies, we work at the cusp of technology innovations. We have a dedicated CTO office as well, which looks into interesting technologies solving typically for medical use cases, which is my prerogative here. And we have been working a lot of experiments around generative AI, and happy to share some of those today with you guys, and more to come as we go through the webinar. As for my earlier background, I've been in life sciences consulting and technology for almost entire of my healthcare career, and I tell people this is the only industry I know. So yeah, pleasure to be in with all of you today.
Great, thanks, Ritesh. And with that, we're going to pivot to going through some element of a presentation for the audience. We're still here. Just keep in mind that we'll be coming back on camera in a couple of minutes. But Ritesh, if you don't mind, yeah, that'd be great. We can maybe give some backdrop in presentation mode. Thanks for that. So as mentioned, from a topical perspective, we're here to talk about the hype versus reality as it relates to generative AI, really consider the applicability in regulatory affairs likewise. And I wanted to take a couple of minutes to talk through some of the relevant topics that we're going to talk in detail over the next couple of minutes. Again, thank you to David Sudhir for coming on your own accord to really share some ideas around this from your own perspective. And likewise, we're going to complement that with some of the things that we've been incubating and exploring likewise from our side. We would love to hear some of the things that are coming from your own thoughts and ideas around what might be the considerations. With that, I'd like to take a couple of minutes to just talk through what we're going to cover today. So specifically, Ritesh will take a couple of minutes to give some backdrop for those of you in the audience that have maybe had some exposure, maybe only just hearing about GPT or ChatGPT you've heard in the industry, but genuinely in the broader scheme of things going beyond ChatGPT, there are a number of GPTs that exist that are more controlling and can create an environment for incubation in the life science industry, and Ritesh will give some clarity in regards to that. We'll also use some relevant experimentation and incubation that we ourselves have been innovating around to consider what might be those applicability use cases, and Ritesh will give some demos around that. But then we need to be really practical in the scheme of things in terms of what are those considerations in the industry as it relates to a regulated and a validated environment, ensuring we have predictability of technologies like this, and obviously ensuring that we can build an element of trust in a digital environment for the future. Lastly, we want to get some appreciation for what are the considerations that you as an individual in the audience can do from within your own organization. What are approaches you can take? What should you anticipate? And how do we bring this to life? I'd like to close by saying that from a housekeeping perspective, there'll be an opportunity. You have a Q&A button on your screen. Feel free to pose a question. Our team on the back end will be collecting those questions. At the very tail end, we're going to go through some of those questions and ask our panelists to give some of their feedback as it relates to what the question is. So really appreciate the interactive intent from this perspective, and we'll get to your questions for sure. With that, before we move on, I'd like to introduce a survey. This is an opportunity for you, the audience, to give some of your own opinion. And at this point, you should be seeing a pop-up on your screen. This first question, really, how familiar are you with generative AI, whether ChatGPT, Bard, and otherwise? Whether you've heard about it in the media, you've had some help, you've had some opportunity to help answer non-work queries, experimented with it at work, or closely adopting it from an organizational perspective. We're going to take about a minute to go through and tabulate responses, so please feel free to put in your vote. The pop-up will come down, and then we'll have a chance to read back those responses. At this point, I'm going to move to the next slide. I appreciate there's a little bit of an overlap in regards to this, but you'll get a chance to see the full view of this. From a conflict of interest perspective, we've been very much appreciative to have our panelists on call. Likewise, we're conscious that the panelists are here on their own accord and not representing their own organizations, really to share their own points of view and not relevant initiatives that might be going on in their organizations. So with that, I'd like to make sure that there's some relevant appreciation for their time today on their own, and certainly want to be sure to make sure that that's a level of clarity that we're able to offer. With that, we're going to move on to some actual backdrop and understanding generative AI. Ritesh, I'm going to pass it on to you to take us through this for a couple of minutes.
Thanks, Vlad. And generative AI as a technology is something which has been going on in the industry. And while we hear of it a lot these days, it all started in 2019 when we started the lung cancer detection from CT scans. And moving on in 2020, GPT-3 was actually able to generate hard to distinguish human written text. And that is when the entirety of journey of generative AI started. And from that, we moved on from detection of prostate cancer biopsies to generating images from text. And once we came into 2022, we realized that ChatGPT became a cult with 1 million users in 5 days. And then it went on to pass all the stories which you have heard about medical licensing. But coming back to 2023, today we have more fascinating examples of GPT. And there's GPT 3.5, we have classifiers, And there are a lot of fit for purpose technologies which have been built on some of these platforms. Now, coming to the core of what we have today, which is the generative AI. What is essentially generative AI? So, generative AI as a technology, to reiterate, is focused on generating text, images, videos, codes, everything from vast amount of data that has been available. And it is a pre-trained model. It uses generative adversarial networks. For some of you who are tech savvy, recurrent neural networks and transformers, and it can be used for multiple tasks. And there are multiple models as well, right from text to text to code to images and whisper, and a lot of applications which have been built on some of these models. And that's where generative AI has been able to do wonders. One of the examples of it is LLM, which are the large language models, which generate natural text from large amount of data. It has been trained on to understand synthetic data based on algos. It uses deep neural networks. And there are a lot of examples around us. GPT-3, BERT are some of this. And finally, coming to the latest avatar, which is the generative pre-trained transformer, which most of us, I would say, on the call are familiar with, which is the Chat GPT. Now, this is built on top of LLM network. It's a neural network that uses transformer architecture. There's encoder, decoder, and there's an attention to focus which the model uses to generate input and output texts. And with 175 billion parameters, that's the latest number. It is the most powerful LLMs. More LLMs are coming into picture. They're solving a lot of use cases, and staying abreast of some of these LLMs while we run experiments and leverage technology is something which we all should be going forward aware of. With that, let's segue, since we have looked into what is LLMs, what are Chat GPT, I'll get back to Vlad to segue into some of the regulatory use cases from here.
Great, thanks for that, Ritesh. And if we can, maybe we had conducted a survey a couple of minutes ago. There's an opportunity to hear back on the results associated with that. And just want to kind of reiterate, the survey was your familiarity with the generative AI. How familiar are you with whether it's ChatGPT, BART, or otherwise? And from the survey results, we've got some good audience participation today of over 130 people on the call. We've got 47% have heard of it in the media. 23% have indicated that they've used it to help answer non-work queries. We've also got 23% that have experimented with it at work in some respects. And this is interesting, some part of the discussion that we'll have today around this topic. And then 8% really closely involved in adopting at an org level at work. So this is exciting to see that we do have some people that are already part of maybe initiatives that are ongoing and progressing to some respect to maybe even incubate in some ways. With that, we'd like to thank your participation. We'll have another survey coming up in a few minutes. And we'll pivot now, Ritesh, if we can, maybe to consider the applicability to regulatory affairs. And here's a couple of use cases. Clearly, there are many more. Your organization might have gone through an approach to basically do an innovation experiment, really do some open-ended whiteboarding and unadulterated by the constraints that technology might provide. We really ourselves have considered what's the art of the possible. So from that perspective, the potential representative use cases in regulatory affairs, number one, entity extraction and custom classification. This could be a relevant use case as it relates to taking data elements out of unstructured text. A very applicable use case has been adverse events. Certainly something that's been longstanding in the use of natural language processing. And in one respect, is this possibly an alternate use case that can perform maybe more effectively and with more consistency and outcome as a potential possibility, but also other use cases that might be specific to regulatory in terms of text extraction as well. The second, in document search and summarization. Again, an opportunity to take unstructured documents, whether they might be literature, regulatory policy, and production of intelligence, and trying to extract those insights and summarizing those, not just performing entity extraction, but getting to the point of actually converting it into a synopsis of sorts that can provide some layer of interpretation associated with what the construct of maybe a large document can provide. The third really exciting an opportunity, and really something that we'd want to pressure test, would be content authoring. And Ritesh is going to give a demonstration of some use case associated with this today. What you're going to see potentially is where a conversion of documentation from one document type into another has potential use cases, such as clinical study reports to lay summaries or otherwise, taking it from structured data to an unstructured narrative format are additional potential that can exist. The fourth example, analysis of data to derive insights. And the relevant use case here that we've considered has been health authority queries. The potential that health authority queries obviously is a large mass and an extensive effort to produce a response associated with that. But with an organization that has a precedent experience with engaging with various health authorities, getting a backdrop of prior questions that have come that might be similar in nature, that opportunity to do analysis associated with similarities to a question that can provide a similar response can at least accelerate the process, if not complete it in entirety, to be clear. But to be honest, I think the construct and opportunity there is a potential use case that is just of our own design. The fifth and the final is regulatory compliance. And very clearly, if you're taking from regulatory documentation and you're trying to drive insights and interpretation associated with that, is there opportunity to actually create checklists associated with requirements that are coming out of different document types and analyzing those as well to be for quality checking. Now, this is very far advanced, but again, these are different use cases for consideration. At this point, I'd like to maybe trigger some questions back to our panelists. And David, if you would, maybe I'll start with you. Based on your understanding and based on your work experiences in the life cycle of working in regulatory affairs and regulatory operations and transformation of technology, how do you see this kind of comparing to past situations? Are there differences that you're anticipating would come from what this can provide compared to what you've seen before?
Sure. I think that the first thing that springs to my mind is how we approach this compared to how we approach technology implementations in the past. I mean, everyone knows what agile means today, but I think we really need to be more agile than ever in how we approach it, since there's less certainty how far and how fast you can go. And that's from a couple of perspectives. The technology is very fast evolving. So what we cannot do today, we probably could do tomorrow. So it's back to that starting small and expand based upon learning, being prepared to change some course direction over time. So that's more from a methodology perspective. And as I said, this technology just arrived in the public view. It's going to evolve very quickly from here. So I think we need to acknowledge that we don't have a picture of how far this can go. But when we design our solutions, I think we need to take into consideration that art of the possible, which may not be possible today, in a year's time, it may very well be possible.
So what I'm hearing is keep your mind open, consider, the brainstorming approach to this might be valuable, not for necessarily saying this is where we would look to initiate. And certainly you can look at the layers of complexity and process of the continuity of outputs that can happen from something like this technology. But are there any key business problems that you might consider that could benefit within regulatory affairs? Any initial thoughts? I know I gave a couple of use cases on the slide here. Any others that we might consider?
Yeah, a few springs to mind. This, I mean, the obvious one for regulatory is obviously documents and reports. And I think you did mention structured data, and I'm going to stick my head out and say that structured content authoring never really taken off, but I would presume that generative AI may even skip over structured content authoring, or we may see technologies combining the two into one. Health authority question you mentioned, is a hot topic, and I know across the industry, in particular any areas which is where speed and effort and consistency is of essence. So if you want to boil that down to what type of reports, what type of documentation or data is really where speed is of essence. Another area would be strategy and submission planning, is generating our launch regulatory strategies as well as our submission planning based on previous experience and a number of logical rules. You can then extend that thinking into, you could argue a little bit more of the enabling side of regulatory. You did mention regulatory intelligence, combining this with chatbots to summarize regulatory intelligence information. But another one, we know that our industry is highly regulated. We work a lot with procedures. I can see generating procedures rather than procedural formal documentation, rather than writing those from scratch every time. And I think the other area, which you also mentioned briefly, Vlad, is quality control validation activities, where we spend a lot of manual effort, where we can use this technology to basically catch a lot of considerations before we start the manual review.
Great, David. These are really exciting ideas and opportunities. Certainly, still a lot of work to basically test these out in incubation before we go live with anything like this, I would imagine, across the industry. But really appreciate your ideas here. Sudhir, how about from your side? I know you come from a great experience of working across clinical and now in regulatory, and this provides a good cross-pollination to certainly an area where regulatory closely partners with clinical regardless. So from your perspective, what are some thoughts around what we both presented and ideas and opportunities that can come from this?
Certainly. I want to echo first what David said about the agility, and what's not possible today could become possible tomorrow, as quickly as tomorrow. That's a key concept to keep in mind as we are experimenting with some of these use cases. And what I would add to what was already discussed was what kind of access do I have for my use cases? And to us, for example, I use ChatGPT 3 and ChatGPT 4 as an example. Some of these use cases that we discuss may not be possible with ChatGPT 3 because the domain literacy, or I would say the medical literacy of ChatGPT 3 relative to ChatGPT 4 is vastly different. What I mean by that is, when I am selecting some of these use cases, I would want to consider what's the literacy of the system that I'm experimenting with, and basically matching that literacy level of the system to these use cases. What I don't want to do is spend a lot of money, a lot of time to train the model in a narrow specific domain that may or may not be translatable for other use cases. Right? I would like to take advantage of the training that has already been imparted to the models. So in that context, I think the entity extraction makes a lot of sense as the first go around. And I also think that, for example, CT redactions is a great example to start with. Literature surveillance is another great example. And then, as you can see, the team, we generate the data from these early examples that could, again, be used for training or enhancing the accuracy of the same model over time. So that way, I would like to progress to next rounds of pages. For example, HA query I would put in the middle of the pack in terms of when I would prioritize that or try that use case with the machines or the systems I have. But in general, the use case types that you have on the screen make a lot of sense to me.
Great. Thanks for that, Sudhir. At this point, we're going to move forward. We've got a couple of great use case examples or demonstrations, actually, that in some ways are unique, but also can complement some of the discussion we just had. Ritesh, I'm going to pass it back to you. You can maybe walk through a couple of these to demonstrate for the audience today.
Perfect. Thanks, Vlad, Sudhir, and David, and thanks for setting that stage. Now let's go through the use cases, and I know quite a few of us are waiting to see some of these in actions. The first use case which we'll show you is around clinical trial data summarization. And look at this use case in terms of conversion of tabular data to text. Let me straight jump into the demo. Now, what you see here is data which has been pulled from clinicaltrials.gov. You'll see the data flow across participants. You have the baseline characteristics, and it goes on and on in terms of statistical analysis and other data, primary endpoints, secondary endpoints, everything. The idea here has been to look at this entire data and convert it to a patient summary and physician summary. We tried a set of prompts, and we continue to try and experiment with different models as well. Like Sudhir just mentioned, we wrote certain JSON prompts, did a lot of programming around it, looked at a lot of diverse documents, and you see there is a whole lot of data which keeps on flowing, including what you see on the screen currently around adverse events. And then this is where we started now setting up prompts and giving instructions. And prompts are obviously a set of instructions and giving JSON codes to the machine. And finally, we ran this entire through the model. And this is how the result started coming across. So what you see here is the summary for patient or layperson. It was done in sections which we instructed the machine to do, starting from introduction to study purpose and details, to benefits and risks. And finally, the machine also created a conclusion. And the conclusion, for example, which you see, the higher dose of pregabalin showed promise in reducing seizures. However, more research is needed. And the conclusions, when we talked to our SMEs, were actually fairly accurate. Now, at the bottom of the screen, you see something very interesting on the right side, which is the flesh reading e-score. Now, what is flesh reading e-score? It's a readability formula that measures the difficulty of written text based on the construct of sentence, the length, and the syllables per word. The score is from 0 to 100. Anything beyond 60 is something which is day-to-day English, and anything beyond 80 is really conversational. The flesh reading score here of 75.6 indicates it is quite easy to read. And that is one indicator of how right the output is, apart from obviously the checks from and balances which we have run on the model to ensure that the data is right. Now we use the same data to generate a physician level summary, which as you go through it, you will realize that it is even more scientific. And the trend, for example, the trial enrolled 175 who were randomized, and there was a fixed dose taper periods. All information would be very clinical and very scientifically written in nature. And then you will also have a conclusion. Again, this is the conclusion which we ran through our SMEs. And again, it has been fairly accurate. So coming back to the point, this is a classic example of a use case where we have looked at a table to text conversion. And this table to text conversion is something which, at least in our side of regulatory, it is a use case which all of us have been grappling for long, but which is actually possible and possible to do, as well as possible to scale up with generative AI. And this is stemming from the experiment which we have been able to run so far. From that, let me move on to the next experiment, which essentially will resonate with a lot of regulatory professionals. Quite a few of you are in the call, to generate informed consent forms from a protocol document. And let me straight jump into, again, the demo. What you see on the left side of the screen is the entire content. We are looking at a protocol to ICF generation. This is a protocol summary, which has fed into the machine through a series of prompts and codes. And then we wrote certain prompts, certain codes in terms of what is exactly the output which we propose to generate from this. And then we ran this through the generative AI model. Now, what you see here is, again, a structured format across certain sections which we had created. What's the purpose of the study? How many people will be there in the study? And all of these have been actually rightly picked up. For example, what you saw highlighted was the purpose of the study to compare treatments, which is absolutely right. And then calling out there will be almost 800 patients in the study. These numbers and the study criteria, how will I receive the drug? Everything is actually fairly accurate. And what we essentially did after this was also to create a kind of summary, which is agnostic of sections, which you are seeing at the bottom. The flesh reading score, which we touched upon, in this case is 57.87. And that's one parameter which we always look at while generating certain documents. What we did was to stretch the logic a little further and use this opportunity to actually create a Spanish summary, a different language summary. Now, again, the machine was able to generate a summary, and it was also able to assign a cosine similarity score. Sorry, just bear with me for a minute. The cosine similarity scoring, what you saw at the bottom, was essentially, okay, just give me a minute. Yeah, I'll stay here. So the cosine similarity scoring, what you saw in the bottom, was essentially an indication of how close is the summary to the actual document. And what we have essentially seen is the summary to the actual document, the similarity in this case is 1. And that's one use case which I think we were fairly excited about when we saw the output. We ran the experiments through some other languages, and looking at cosine similarity score, looking at the accuracy of ICFs, even our SMEs were, like, okay, this is something which is really, really exciting for us. Now, let me take a pause here and tell you, because it is important and some of you may be looking forward to it, is how have we actually done it? Like people say, under the hood. We have extensively used prompt engineering and additional coding. And prompt engineering is nothing but, in terms of layman output, instructions which you are giving to the machine to generate the right output. The beauty of generative AI is, in earlier stages, you would pass on the requirements to tech, and tech would develop a platform for you and give it to you. This is a classic technology where prompt engineering and coding happen together to generate the right output. And this is where, professionals, a lot of us who are on the call, actually work in tandem to generate this kind of an output. And then there are specific, obviously, ways to eliminate potential biases and, like people say, hallucinations. But all of that has been possible with generative AI. Now, let's move on to a little more complex scenario. And all of us, have these data repositories. We call at some of us call it DMS. Others have different kind of terminologies which are there. Essentially, there's a lot of data residing in some of these document management systems. The challenge is the data usability is fairly limited. So when you ask a certain question or when you query the database, the kind of answers or the outputs you get are suboptimal, and it's very difficult to use some of these data sets. We looked at a use case where we could actually summarize, look at certain keywords, and ask queries to the machine. And let me show you how we did that. And as always, I'll also talk to you about what happens in the background. So this is our own in-house tool which we developed. What you see currently on the screen is an interface where you can browse and upload files. For the sake of today, we have actually uploaded a few files where you see on the left-hand side. And there what we are looking at is to generate summaries. So if we look at or click on a specific file, it actually goes ahead and generates a summary. Now this summary, what we had instructed was around 250 words. And what it essentially is intended to give is an essence of the document along with certain keywords. So the keywords you would find at the bottom, it's for the clinical drug interaction studies guidance is for investigational drug as a keyword, COC, DDI, all of those you will see in the bottom. And this actually takes us to the next part where how do you query the document? Let me also show you the base document from which it has been created. Now, what you see here is the base document. It is close to 10 pages long. And these 10 pages long document has been summarized into 250 words for anybody to actually see a summary. The keywords are also clickable, where you can, if you click any keyword, you can go inside the document and see exactly where that keyword has been called out. Now, similarly, I'll move ahead. There's another document which we have created, but let's get on to the interesting part. And the interesting part is to select a file and key in your query. So what we essentially did here was, just give me a second. So what you essentially see here is we have selected a file and the user is at the liberty to select one file or multiple files to query a particular, to put in a particular query. For example, here we have selected clinical drug interaction studies guidance, and we are looking at what are the situations when COC DDI studies should be conducted. What the machine has done is actually to generate an answer. And here comes in the, sorry, just give me a minute. Sometimes you get too excited about the technology. So yeah. Now, here comes in the entire part about how do you explain what has been written? Is it right or wrong? And that is where what we have called out at the bottom, what the machine has been able to generate is the sources and also the content from where it has come. Now, this is essentially to ensure there is a lot of trust and explainability in the output which is generated here. You see the file has been called out. The answers has been sourced from clinical drug interaction studies, page number 2. And what we'll shortly do is to navigate to the original document and show you page number 2, what exactly was written and, how has the machine been able to pass that data and generate the information. Now, when COC studies are conducted, this is the exact section which has been used by the machine to generate an answer. And if I go ahead and look at, this is the page number 2 from where the machine was able to generate the answer. Now, the same is applicable if you go ahead and select multiple documents as well and ask questions. So I'll just move on and show you here. Let me show you something more fascinating. So yeah, what you see here is essentially a couple of documents which are being queried for an answer. And the machine again will show you the details of the answer. And it would also show you the sources and the content from where the data has been generated. Now, this use case is certainly, something which has implications across the historical data, which traditionally has been a challenge to use that data. Now, how does technology work at the back end? Again, as promised, we'll give you a sense of what is under the hood. And what essentially the generative AI does is to chunk the documents, break it into chunks, store it as a vector database, in technology parlance, what it is called. But essentially, any query that you run, we have used LangChain framework, and that query is queried across those chunks. So the entire document would be broken down into sections, sections would be broken down into chunks, and those chunks are the one which will be queried for answer. And these answers which you see are generated from those chunks of queries. So this is the use case scenario, and I hope it has resonated with quite a few of you. And with that, I think there was a lot of interest and a lot of excitement around the final use case, which I'll show you. And our esteemed panel spoke about it. The entire entity extraction, which could be a case, which could be solved for by generative AI. And we have deliberately picked something which is very interesting, because in entity extraction, when we as reviewers look at it, it is important to both understand the content and the context. For example, what I mean by that is, if we are looking at an adverse event, the example which you see on the left, the patient was admitted to the hospital for epilepsy and previously suffered from asthma. Once administered medication, the patient started to show symptoms of dizziness. For most of us, it would be a no-brainer that dizziness is the adverse event which is being called out. But historical models have had challenges to distinguish dizziness from asthma, from epilepsy. And that's where what we figured out, with the right language prompts and everything, generative AI was able to do that very beautifully. And this is what you see here. Let me stay on the content for a minute. This is a 45-year male. The patient reported that after taking Sofal for 3 days, multiple adverse events characterized by severe dizziness, shortness of breath, and chest pain. Now, these are exactly the adverse events. And then you have a history where patient vitals were as follows and all of those details. What you will see here is the machine has extracted adverse events, the onset date, the medication which triggered it, what was the indication, what was the start date and end date, and what were the medical events even associated with it. For example, the past medications, the diagnosis, lab results, vital signs. So where we began with was, if you recall, the first use case, which I spoke few minutes back, was table data to text. Now this is text to tabular data, which can go on to any database. These are some of the examples which we actually wanted to showcase around generative AI use cases. And maybe I hope some of you have been able to resonate with it. But at this point of time, I'll hand it over back to our industry experts for their perspectives.
Great. Thanks for that, Ritesh. I appreciate you going through these. Looks like we're getting some kudos and appreciations coming in as we complete this section. I'd like to kind of pivot at this point into the considerations associated with this, and certainly something that you demonstrated and you gave some good clarity as it relates to how do you essentially stage this, how do you facilitate this in an incubation environment. We need to consider, obviously, how do you deploy this? What are the considerations associated with scaling? You touched a bit on hallucination and just some of the areas for our consideration as well. But with that, I'm going to maybe trigger our second survey. And at this point, you'll see a pop-up appear on your screen again. And then we're going to continue with that survey to consider what are your top concerns of adopting generative AI in regulatory affairs. And we'll give this a minute to basically go through this. We'll then give some considerations from our side. And then likewise, I'd like to open it up to the panelists to discuss this in the balance of our call. So can you trust generative AI to generate accurate outputs? Do data privacy and security concerns and patient data create concerns? You're unsure of how this will fit in your current process, or are all of these relevant concerns? I'm just going to give a minute associated with this. And while we do that, Ritesh, what we can do is we can pull up the last screen, then we're going to go off screen and we're going to go off slides, and we're going to come back on camera in just a minute. And so while you can only see part of the screen, we'll start up with the challenges observed initially on the left side, and then some potential considerations in terms of addressing these challenges. Like mentioned by Ritesh earlier on, quality and consistency, of course, is something that we've heard in both internal conversations and likewise as we've been experimenting from our own end to consider how do we ensure consistency in the outputs. If these models are continuously evolving, is there a way to create controls around this? And likewise, obviously, there's training environments that need to occur, ensuring the prompt engineering is correct, and ensuring that there's wrappers or basically some barriers to the way that you set this up. For sure, this is a digital process in that respect, and we need to consider that this is all done in the construct of that. Second is trust and explainability. So as we consider the reliance on technology in some respects, and maybe we're relinquishing some level of responsibility from the human process, what are approaches that can be taken to do this in a controlled way, to maybe manage systematic processes is a possibility. Obviously, creating trust but verify approaches to this, and certainly something I'd like to open up to the panelists in just a second for more discussion around these aspects. There's the infrastructure component as well. Within your own environment, you want to make sure you're protecting both your company data, likewise ensuring that those of the patients that you're servicing, and what are approaches there to make sure that you're leveraging cloud environments or security controls or behind firewalls, or of course, practical considerations to this. And data bias, I'm just going to kind of read the last couple off. Data bias, lack of control on the output, similarly, making sure that you've got verifiable, consistent outputs that you can cross-reference back, ensuring that there's no influencing potentially incorrectly. And lastly, ensuring that there's compliance to the regulatory requirements. Incorrectly positioning, for example, lay summaries or summaries of regulatory rules, but not in completeness, can potentially become an influencer to a certain facet of the regulatory rule, but maybe not the completeness of the insight. With that, what I want to do, maybe in the interest of time, is just read out what we heard on the survey results, and at this point, basically pivot back to the panelists. So just give me a second as I look for the results here. Okay, great. So what we're seeing, I'm going to read this back out for the audience. Top concerns of adopting generative AI. At 29%, can I trust generative AI to generate accurate outputs? Second, at 18%, data privacy and security as the patient data is involved is a concern at 18%, I said. Third, at 8%, I'm unsure how this will fit into our current processes. I suspect that many of you are feeling some level of confidence that you see applicability to this. And then lastly, and most importantly, at 45%, all of the above in some ways. So whether you're unsure or whether you're seeing relevant concerns that are from the other two, those all might be aspects to your response to that. With that, Ritesh, what we can do is maybe take the slides down. I'm going to pivot back to our panelists on the call. And I'd like to really hear from your side, David and Sudhir, and likewise, I'll even ask Ritesh for some of your thoughts. But Sudhir, I'm going to start with you, if it's okay. While we presented a couple of considerations, Ritesh gave some demos, obviously, in an incubation environment. But taking it a step further, what are things that the audience should think about? What are considerations that we might need to think about, either elaborating further on what was presented and or some of your own thoughts?
Totally. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Very good. So I want to start off with a few themes that I would think that we all need to keep in mind as we are thinking about implementation. So one is, personally, I think it's not yet a fully generalized artificial intelligence that is available to us. I would like to see that it is an augmented intelligence that is available to us. And to your data, can I trust what generative AI tells me? It goes back to what kind of data you have used to train the model, what kind of data others have used in the pre-training of those machines. The second one you said about trust but verify, that I'll come to that in a minute. The third important one is this goes back to early Tesla days, fully driving in full autopilot mode, and it was, I think, the first accident. And then there was a lot of argument about the accident rate caused by humans versus machines. What stuck out of that little episode then was, in general, I would think that we forgive humans for their mistakes because we are human, but we hold the machines to a much higher standard. In other words, we don't forgive machines as easily as we forgive humans. So those are some of the things I would think we would keep in mind as we think about implementations. And now coming back to, so maybe I will talk about 3 or 4 points for implementation. One is, I think, the selection of use cases in the early days as organizations try to gear up to experiment with and try these. The selection of use cases is important. I would say low risk, medium value, and where is the output going to? Is it to operationalize or improve the efficiencies of internal processes versus getting the output in the hands of regulators? So use case selection, point number 1, is an important aspect. The second one, to your trust but verify, I would argue that the business processes that inherently have a human in the loop are most ripe for early adopters. This fulfills the need for that trust but verify principle. And then the third one I would argue is when we are implementing them at scale, think about continuous learning cycle. How do you incorporate the outputs again being fed back with the help of the human in the loop. So you are constantly improving the accuracy of the model. It's almost like you are maintaining it as the machine is delivering the desired output. So those are some of the considerations I would argue we need to think about. Underlying all of this is the organizational readiness, right? So that you know, selecting the use cases, implying the principles of trust but verify, building those continuous learning cycles, they all go and strengthen the organizational readiness over time. Back to you, Len.
Yeah, no, that's great, Sudhir. I think certainly a lot to consider, and I appreciate the point that you make as it relates to creating a feedback loop. Certainly, as you educate the system, you want to ensure that there's a quality process to what is being produced, but ideally, then it begins to learn over time, and there's an opportunity from that as well. David, how about from your side, maybe some things that you might be able to complement in terms of considerations from your thoughts?
Yeah, I think I can build on that trust theme there, which is more of a cultural mindset, which needs to be addressed equally alongside the technology. And I like the Tesla example there. Another example springs to mind. I was part of introducing electronic signatures when it was first new in the industry back roughly 20 years ago. And the skepticism was very high. Today, 20 years later, we basically sign everything electronically, whether it's at work or in a daily life. But it took a few years to not introduce the technology, but actually change that mindset. And I think there are a number of parallels there that we need to be cognizant of as we approach this. There's something that referred to as XAI, and I think you mentioned that, Vlad, explainable AI, which historically been one of the weaknesses of artificial intelligence, being able to arrive at a conclusion, but not really being able to explain how it got there. This is making strides in the right direction. I'm very curious about how that evolves, because I think that could also be a game changer for that in our industry, and in particular regulatory and research, is also the ability to explain how the algorithm arrived to the conclusion. Mm-hmm. The other thing that I think Sudhir touched was that augmentable AI, and approaching this, at least initially, seeing it as an assistant to the decision maker rather than the decision maker itself, and getting people used to understanding how this technology is working, how it's improving, and using that as an assistant to speed up decision making, to make higher quality decisions, again, rather than being the definite decision maker. Mm-hmm. The other consideration I just want to mention briefly is, which was also I think was touched on earlier, is the availability of data. It's very simple. The more books we humans read, the wiser we get. Machines are no different. So it's very much about having availability to big data and quality data, and the better outcome you get. So I think there's another theme, probably for a longer discussion, is where there are areas where we may not have sufficient amount of data. Are there possibilities of pooling data? Thinking of Cumulus, for example, which is starting looking at HAQs, obviously with intellectual property and privacy concerns, etc., in mind. Is there a possibility across the industry to do something there?
Yeah, certainly very valuable, David, when we consider the broader industry and the support to all the pharma and med device in particular. Some organizations just lack the exposure to large volumes of data, and certainly something that we want to make sure that we're able to support equally. Last thing, I think, as a question goes, I know we're coming on about 5 minutes left, and I wanted to give a little bit of a chance for the audience questions that have come in so far. As a lasting questions in terms of organizational preparedness, and Sudhir, maybe a lasting thought from your side as it relates to what people can do, what can organizations do to ensure that they're embracing this concept and beginning to go down the journey of considering these for eventual implementation potentially.
Here's what I found.
Can you hear me okay?
Sorry, Sudhir. Yeah, I don't know if I think my watch went off and it triggered something. But yeah, I guess I was looking to ask Sudhir, maybe yourself, and then maybe David, if one of you can maybe kind of comment on this as it relates to organizational readiness. What do you propose to people? What do you suggest that they can do to begin to kind of go down the journey of exploring this?
Sure, I could be. Go ahead, Dave.
Oh, go ahead.
Sorry,
I'll be
Sudhir.
brief, and I'll be brief, and I'll hand it over to David right away. So I would think organizing sessions within the organization to just raise a level of awareness is one aspect of it. You know, ChatGPT is now available, and one can, in my opinion, easily instantiate an instance within the company. And then now offering that, firewalled company-specific instance of ChatGPT, for example, offering that to the staff, the early adopters, this is another, and then providing some guidelines on use cases, and when the literacy of these models of the systems, etc., providing that information is also useful, and allowing it for experimentation in controlled settings in really small groups would go a long way. That, over to you, David.
Thanks. It's a little bit of a summary, but it's that, again, take time to learn and understand. We're still early days, and this will rapidly evolve over the coming years. The other aspect is start thinking about what capabilities, what expertise is needed in the organization to drive this forward. This technology, again, is rapidly evolving. What capabilities do we need to understand everything from the art of the possible to actually applying it? Don't underestimate that culture and mindset. Work on the trust, how you implement it to ensure the right adoption. And the last point is work very closely with your technology, business, compliance teams, because this touches all those areas and needs to be considered in all those areas.
Great, thanks. And I know we're coming on about 3 minutes, so I'm going to just field a couple of quick questions. David, Sudhir, and Ritesh, I'll channel a couple of these just across the board, what's coming in. The first one that I'm seeing, David, I might look to get your opinion on this really in terms of content authoring in the areas of CMC. Do you see a relevant applicability from just the surface of this? Is there a potential that could be explored?
I don't see why not. I don't see any limitation in any of the disciplines. I mentioned before, we're curious to see if there a case for a combination of structured content and Gen AI. And I guess the more data-rich documents where we generate more tables, listings, I could see more of a stronger use case for the combination of the two.
And if we can then just continuing, Sudhir, an additional question, and I know this is very new. What's your experience, opinion on this in terms of different models that exist out there? I think you were very keen on making sure that fit for purpose is considered. There's Google Bard AI, ChatGPT, and others that exist out there. What's your opinion in regards to that? Are there should the audience be considering alternates when considering the use cases?
Yeah, that's a great question. And, the mathematical underpinnings for all of these models was like, 60, 70 years ago. So it's not the model in my mind. It's actually the literacy of the model that I would value the most. If that literacy is something that is very critical for my use case, that's the system that I would use. So I would argue that, look at what is that training that the machine has undergone or the system has undergone, and if that has a close relevance to your use cases, go for it.
Great, great. Yeah, thanks for that. I know we've come on time as it relates to this 1-hour session that we've opened up to the audience. We do have a lasting survey for those that can stay back and answer the survey. But before we got to that, I'd like to ask, or actually express my gratitude to David, yourself, and Sudhir for participating in this. Really look forward to continuing the discussion across the industry. But certainly thank you for your participation today. So for the audience, was today's webinar useful? Hopefully you're able to give a quick prompt response to that, and do appreciate the audience's time today as well. We'll be sharing this with those of you that were able to join, and certainly could look to try and respond to these questions offline that have come in. We've got a number of them that we weren't able to get to, but certainly thank you all today, and have a good rest of your day as well. Thanks, David. Thanks, Sudhir. Pritesh, likewise. Okay,
Thanks.
take care.
Thanks, everyone. Thank you.